Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Kish. Okay, today we're doing another Kish critiques. I like this idea, I'm really excited about it, and I hope you enjoy it a lot. Why? Because, even though I strike a neutral position here, in that I'm not advocating, a pro-Mormon position or an anti-Mormon position, but I'm primarily interested in geeking out about Mormonism. I think geeking out about Mormonism can take a lot of forms, and one of those is critiquing the other people out there who are talking about Mormonism, either in an advocating or criticizing position, and also just demonstrating something of my personal values and approach to things, because regardless of the fact that I'm not taking a position on the LDS Church or any branch of the Restoration, I still feel like my work can be informed by my personal values. So some of those critiques will come out of those personal values. One of them is fairness. I believe in being fair. Another one is integrity. And another one is giving your opponents the benefit of the doubt and refusing to straw man them. But also, I think, showing respect for other people, for other human beings. And I think there are some values that can and should transcend one's political affiliations, religious affiliations, ethnic affiliations, etc., etc. They're just core values of being a good human being. That's a position of a kind in itself. I understand that, but I think it's an important position for me to hold if I'm going to operate with integrity and in a way I can be proud of when I do my work here on the Coffee with Kish channel. So, who am I criticizing today, or critiquing? Because I don't really like the word criticize. People take the word critic and criticize in negative ways. I don't think they're negative. I am an academic, so, for me, critique, criticism, critics, all of those things. Critics, in my world, are primarily people who analyze text very closely. They're textual critics. And so they're not partisans for an ideological or religious perspective or opponents of such. They're rather just people who are closely examining something, finding problems, seeking solutions to things that are unknown or ambiguous. So critics can play an important function, but usually in the Mormon, ex-Mormon, anti-Mormon world of discussion, critic is often used in a negative sense to be someone who fights the truth. Obviously there's a wider use of that term critic and criticize and critique. They have wider usages than just, fighting the things that you hold dear, that you believe to be true, criticizing you and your positions. Critique is a really broad term. So today I am critiquing another person that I really like and whose association I've had loosely for decades now, and that is John Dehlin of Mormon Stories. So let me tell you something about my personal history with John Dehlin. In the early 2000s, I created a Yahoo group with a friend of mine, and I'm not going to get into all of the details of that. I'm proud of the group. I'm proud of what we did. And it went for some years until the Yahoo group sort of faded away and people started moving to other platforms. But for a while, I was very intensely involved in this Yahoo group that I created with a dear friend who is today an active and faithful member of the LDS Church. Was active and questioning at the time that we had the group, and so it was a forum, a Yahoo group, where people were questioning, criticizing, sometimes defending the LDS Church, but there was a heck of a lot of questioning and criticizing going on. And into this mix lo and behold, came John Dehlin at the time when he was still working for Microsoft. He was one of these questioners, criticizers, but still, trying to find a way in the LDS Church, as he was for many years. He was kind of in that mode for a very long time until I think decisively the church made its move and excommunicated him. And I'm not going to comment on any of those things in a positive or negative way. To me, these are just the facts. He was in that mode of questioning, and then the church, I guess, finding him perhaps too adversarial and not giving them enough of a neutral stance or positive press. They just, they had their calculations. I don't know exactly what they are. They don't share their calculations for why they take disciplinary action against someone. There you go. Anyhow, but this was back in the time, and I would say maybe kind of early days. I don't know his whole biography, but early days of his questioning and doubting. And let me tell you why I say it may have been early days. That's because on this group, John took us to task. The rest of the group, he asked the question, and I thought it was a good question at the time. He said, "Why is everyone so negative around here? I don't want to be negative. I want to find a positive way of interacting about these issues. But, here everybody's just criticizing and being negative." Well, I thought that was maybe a slight exaggeration, but I really felt there was truth to what John was saying. And that opened up a very short-lived dialogue between me and John that also included at one point in time a message exchange over something like AOL Messenger, if I'm even remembering that correctly. This is in the stone age of online activity. I was out in Utah visiting my family that's in Utah on one of my summer pilgrimages, as it were. And I was on the computer on AOL Messenger, and suddenly John Dehlin pops up, and he's still trying to work through this question, like what can we do here? Because you guys are so negative, and I don't like that. And I said, John, I'm sorry. I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, and here's the thing: the group is what the group is, and the people are where they are. But you can certainly start your own thing. In whatever form it takes, where you strike the balance that you feel is productive and not critical all the time. I'm sure I didn't use exactly those words. I'm recalling this entirely from memory. I didn't journal it later that day, so I can tell you, by referring back to my journaling. See, you should journal, guys, even if you're not active LDS. Journaling has its benefits. Does John remember this? Probably not. I'm not important in John's larger world. I don't have any direct contact with John anymore. It's probably difficult to have direct contact with John because he's become a sort of minor public figure in connection with Mormonism, and he does a lot of work trying to help people who are, having problems in their faith transitions or with spousal conflicts over faith transitions. So he's a busy guy, and Mormon Stories has become this huge phenomenon. So I'm sure he doesn't probably even remember that stuff, but it made a big impression on me, that, and I have to say, I guess you can say that this is a little bit of bragging on my part. I will admit it, because I sort of felt like I had this view of John through the years that maybe other people didn't have. Now, of course, there are plenty of people who have more of an insider view on John Dehlin than I do, but I thought I would share some of mine because I'm going to critique him here. I'm going to critique his words and some of the things he does on Mormon Stories that I don't think are productive, honestly. And I say this as a fan, generally speaking, a longtime fan of Mormon Stories. So over the years, and I would say probably in the early 2000s, I was a lot more active in John Dehlin's world. I talked to him on the phone a couple of times. I think the last time I talked to him on the phone was just maybe 10 years ago, probably about 10 years ago. I talked to him on the phone about something not directly related to Mormonism, but I wanted his advice on how to help the Mandean people in Iraq. And I don't know why John came to mind. I think it was primarily because he's a node in a larger communication network, and I was working with an activist, a Mandean, who was trying to promote the welfare of his people as some of them were migrating to the United States, and I thought John would be a good person to contact. Our conversation was kind of a disappointment in a sort of reality check way, whereas John was telling me, the LDS people are not really going to understand the Mandeans, who they are. I don't really see this going anywhere or how I can help you. And so, I thought that he was probably a better judge of that than I am because he has a heck of a lot more experience. And unfortunately, that didn't pan out. I wasn't able to do a lot for my activist friend. And really, I think it was mostly because I don't have much juice myself. You have to have capital to spend. And as just a nameless academic at a state university, I don't have a lot of capital to spend. And what I do have is probably really mostly in my own field, in my own classroom, et cetera, not to help an activist who practices a religion that I'm really not a scholar of anyway. Enough of that. Okay, so that was my last phone conversation with John. It happened about a decade ago. But I have been behind the scenes, sometimes defending John Dehlin, defending Mormon Stories, because, as I said to him in a much earlier phone conversation that probably happened almost 2 decades ago now, I love the basic concept of Mormon Stories. This is important to crystallize in your mind. I really believe in the basic core foundational concept of Mormon Stories. And that is that you bring people onto this podcast, onto this show, and you let them tell their story, right? And that I felt was invaluable. Here you have this new world of podcasting, and people are taking to this like wildfire. And you get Mormons on there to tell their own stories. And it's almost like being a public oral historian, where you get this really amazing information just by letting people speak for themselves. And I think Mormon Stories did a fantastic job of that. It brought on Mormon scholars, activists, apologists, regular people who were losing their faith, all kinds of people across the Mormon spectrum. But of course, John was going through his own journey, and eventually that journey led him out of the church. And as time went on, you could see that John became more negative about the LDS church. I think that's unfortunate in a way. I think it's kind of a mistake. And not because I think there's anything wrong with John's personal journey, but I felt like it kind of clouded the resource that Mormon Stories was as public history. Now, of course, Mormon Stories is always going to be important because all of this stuff has historical value of some kind. But as concerns the documentation of this oral history of average Mormon people, Mormon scholars, important Mormon people, just bringing them all together to tell their story. He sacrificed some of the purity of that concept as he moved on to do other things, and things that are also in their own way arguably very important and crucial, like helping couples who are having trouble in their marriage because someone in the marriage has a faith crisis, whereas the other person is really faithful. That, I think, is, an angel's work to do to help couples work through this thing and maintain a good marriage. And it's a very challenging thing to do. That faith crisis, one partner being unequally yoked, so to speak, with the other, it's just a fact. It's going to be a problem. And to the extent that John was able to help couples that were in different places remain true to their faith commitments or lack thereof, to maintain their personal integrity, but while maintaining a healthy marriage. That's a good thing, and I applaud that. Now, of course, when he started getting more negative, he lost some of the faithful voices that had been willing to come on his show. And I think there's the loss, right? You're not going to get Terrell Givens. You're not going to get Richard Bushman. You're not going to get Claudia Bushman. You're not going to get Fiona Givens. You're not going to get all of these people who maintain faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ and as they understand it, and who are active and loyal members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They're just not going to come close to John because now John has become radioactive. And, I think you can say that that's one of the impacts of his excommunication. I'm not going to speculate as to whether that was an intention behind his excommunication, a delegitimization of him, so that the water would be less cloudy and his opposition to the church would be more clear and fixed. Possible, maybe not. I'm not in those back rooms where people are contemplating and praying about making those judgment calls, so I don't know. Anyway, so as a listener to Mormon Stories, I've noticed this, but I've never had a problem with John myself, generally speaking. Of course, there are issues where I really disagree with him. But I feel like I'm in a place where this doesn't really affect me one way or the other. That said, even if it may not impact me, my mindset, where I'm at, who I am as a person, that he's more critical, I still think it's important. Like when I watch things, I want to see certain values maintained. Because I think they're advantageous. And I'm not a big believer in boycotting, by the way, so I'm not boycotting Mormon Stories when I feel like it falls short of my own values. But I will. This is Coffee with Kish. It's also Kish critiquing. I'm going to say something to critique what I see as a problem on Mormon Stories. John he's not going to care about this, and it's not an attack on John. It's an example of where I think we see unnecessary division and the generation of bad feelings between LDS people, former LDS people, non-LDS people, etc., etc. So I think one of the big problems that Mormons face is ridicule. And some people, particularly on the ex-Mormon, post-Mormon, non-Mormon side, might be kind of flummoxed about that or confused, like, why is that a problem? Mormons are weird, so they do ridiculous things. Well, I'm sorry, guys, but everyone does things that from somebody else's perspective look ridiculous, right? It's just a fact. And I think it's healthy when a person is able to take that in stride when others call out things in their lives that, they see ridiculous about us, and we can kind of just brush it off and say, nerds to you, you have your own problems. I'm not going to take this to heart. But I think it can reach a certain critical mass where it becomes a problem, and it becomes a form of cultural bullying. And a way of marginalizing people. You might think that this, again, is really odd of me to say, because some would argue, and particularly people who are critical of the LDS Church, that the LDS Church engages in bullying itself. And I'm not here to argue that point. I'm not here to question the veracity of that claim at all or support it. I certainly see what you're talking about. So I respect your point of view on that. And so here's the thing, though. the insidiousness of this bullying of Mormons is that it ends up impacting average Mormon people in the world. And I'll give you a small example. I have a dear friend. I won't name this person or say too much about my relationship with them, but this person in my life went out for a job in New England, in the New England area. And sitting down at an interview for this job in a place of the country where there aren't that many Mormons, some of the interviewers, because this person had an interview with multiple people over the course of a day for this job, some of the people who were interviewing my friend said, oh, I see you're Mormon. Does your dad drive a carriage? Does your dad have a funny beard and no mustache? In other words, does your dad look like Brigham Young? It seemed like this person had this image of Mormons like they're Amish or something. Now, I'm sorry, but that's just completely unprofessional. Anyone who asks such a question should be disciplined by their employer for that kind of behavior. Well, where does that come from? It comes from ignorance, number one. It comes from a lack of professionalism, but it also comes from the bullying, the sort of casual bullying that comes from marginalizing people through ridiculing their culture. In a sense, people will say, well, it's okay to do this to Mormons because they represent white culture and, they're in league with the powers, the man, and everything. But, I'm sorry, there are Mormons of all kinds. And whereas what you are saying might be true in a sense of people like Mitt Romney, I still don't condone this kind of ridicule, because it impacts people who are just out there living their lives, working in fast food restaurants, trying to interview for a job in the New England region. It has a real impact. Now, my friend, didn't get this job. To this day, I don't know whether that bigotry had a role to play in all of this. So let me get back to the point. Mormon Stories. John, I love John, in a lot of ways. I think he's a great guy. He's well-intentioned. But one thing that John is not, and he's just going to have to accept this criticism because it is part of his personality. I think it's one of those flaws. Like, we all have flaws, and this is one of John's. John isn't careful. Is that going to be a shock to anyone? John is not a careful person. John is very transparent in a way, but he's also not necessarily judicious. He kind of reacts spur of the moment spontaneously and says things that get him into trouble. Trouble with his own fans, trouble with others. And I would say that John's paid a price for not always being as careful as he might be. And, John is John. He leads his life. I'm not trying to affect his life in any way negatively. I'm not saying everybody should boycott John. That's not my point at all. But one thing I would say I am comfortable doing here today is I would say I do not recommend that LDS people who really feel like they're in a vulnerable place with their faith, I don't advocate them watching John's show or listening to John's show. And I feel bad saying that because I think there's a lot of value in things that John does. And the specific episode that I'm thinking of right now and the instance that bothered me, well, it took place on part of a really amazing series. It's an amazing series about Mormonism and race, in which he's looking at Second-Class Saints, the Matthew Harris book. He has Matthew Harris on, and you learn so many incredible things. And by the way, I would even say that some of those things that you would learn in this series would help you understand how the church works in ways that would actually probably reinforce your faith. And this is the weird thing about Mormon stories. John can come off as just an anti-Mormon sometimes. I don't really think John is accurately described as an anti-Mormon. Because I think of an anti-Mormon as someone who, in a rather simplistic and almost relentless way, is representing the worst of Mormonism and caricaturing it on purpose for the specific purpose of driving someone out of the church. Um, on the other hand, John cannot be an anti-Mormon, and I don't believe in clumsily applying labels in ways that are unproductive, that are hurtful. And in other words, I'm not going to be a bigot toward John because I think that he has lacked sufficient care in some of his language on this show. It's a great show. So in this most recent episode that I listened to, I don't know that it's the most recent episode, he had Black Latter-day Saints or Black former Latter-day Saints. I don't know exactly where each of them is. I thought I heard that each one of them had now at least left belief, if not left the church itself. Some of them may be attending, and they were public about this, so I'm not telling you anything that they didn't freely share themselves on the show. But they started talking about their patriarchal blessings and some of the impacts that race had, they felt, on their patriarchal blessings. And, I hate to say it, but I think, yeah, there were definite impacts. And I personally believe, I would love to see that something be done to reverse that damage, even up to giving different patriarchal blessings, honestly, because such a thing can be done, and I think there are probably cases where that would be appropriate, but it's not my call, and I want to emphasize that. I'm not pressuring the church in any way to do that. I'm saying I would personally love to see that happen, but I'm not going to write the church leaders. I'm not going to do anything to agitate for that because I would be violating what I think are the ground rules of my platform here. So, so they're talking about patriarchal blessings. Now, the interesting thing here is that I felt John's guests were a lot more careful and productive in their criticism of their experience of patriarchal blessings. And they were honestly a heck of a lot more open-minded than John. I wouldn't say that they represented themselves as believers, but they definitely represented themselves as being more open-minded. One of the guests said that they had had the experience of lots of things in their patriarchal blessing coming true. Now, this is a person who no longer believes or says that they no longer believe in the church, but they believe that their patriarchal blessing came true nonetheless, and that that's an interesting situation to be in when you don't believe. And I agree, that's an interesting situation. Another person said, well, I do think there's something to these patriarchal blessings. Even if the church's position on what's going wrong, even if I don't agree with the theology, I do think that there can be some value, potential value in a patriarchal blessing. And I thought that was a very mature and perceptive observation myself. And I can get into why I would say that. And it has nothing to do with supporting supernatural theological position, nor did it in this person's explanation for why they thought patriarchal blessings could be valid. But I thought that was great. I thought that was a really mature and perceptive take on the situation. And unfortunately, there was John. And I thought John was unfortunately dismissive, to the point of, I would say, just being ignorant about patriarchal blessings. Now, John is, of course, completely entitled to his own views, and he's entitled to make his show whatever he wants to make of his show. I'm not sitting here telling John what to do, because it isn't my place at all. But Kish critiques. I'm going to give you my perspective on John being dismissive about patriarchal blessings. So the show did include a lot of information about patriarchal blessings that would almost seem calculated to demystify patriarchal blessings. And demystify, I don't think, is the optimal word here. I would say profanation is probably closer to the truth. That what they were saying was taking something that some people hold sacred, and they were casting a profane light on that. A viewpoint that seeks to remove that sense of the sacredness of it. Now, those statements can be factual statements about it, and yet at the same time, they can challenge someone's sense that their experience is sacred. That's a big deal to me. I'm a big believer in the idea of the sacred. And what I'm talking about here doesn't have anything to do necessarily with supernaturalism. It can. And I'm not against supernaturalism. I think supernaturalism is a valid philosophical position, just as materialism is a valid philosophical position. And you can choose to be whatever you want. If you want to be a supernaturalist, fine. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. If you want to be a materialist, if you want to be engaged in a real tense rumination on the difference between and the tensions between and the conflicts between naturalism and supernaturalism, then Mormon theology is a great place to do that, because there's a great deal of materialism in Mormon theology, while at the same time a recognition of the divine, which people usually put in the supernatural category, but which Mormonism, many would argue who understand Mormon theology, they don't place that in a supernatural. God doesn't belong in a supernatural realm. All right, but that's leaving that aside. John treated patriarchal blessings with disdain and ridicule. I think he went over that line. To me, in my observation, he went over that line, and I think that's unfortunate. I really think the value of a patriarchal blessing isn't that an angel comes down and hands a sheet of paper to the patriarch and says, here is God's message for this person. There's a human conduit, as there is for blessings, as there is for all of these kinds of things where a human being is involved in the revelation process for those who believe in divine revelation. There are people who will use various devices to say that, well, this is just boilerplate language, cookie cutter, everybody who got the patriarchal blessing from that patriarch got the same blessing, and blah, 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 and yada, yada, all these claims. And what it's really designed to do is to say this isn't really anything. This isn't special. You shouldn't care about it. In fact, it's kind of dumb. All right? That's what they're saying. They're demystifying, they're prophanizing, making profane the patriarchal blessing. I think, honestly, I think that's terrible. I do. I mean, if you're a scholar studying these things from an outsider's perspective, I think certainly any data you get is worthwhile. But let's take the position of a faithful LDS person who received a patriarchal blessing, uses it as it was intended to be used, to reflect upon, seek revelation about, go to for sustenance and to reinforce personal values. And then someone comes along and just rips it out of their hand, crumples it up, and throws it on the ground, and say, there are a million more where that came from, and that's nothing special. the person who's doing that thinks they're doing something to the LDS Church. I think you're doing something to the person who had the patriarchal blessing and valued it. And honestly, uh, I have a hard time thinking how you're a friend to that person by doing that. Now, I know you're going to argue that you are a friend to this person in doing that because you want to um, straighten them out and get them out of the cult, and all of this really charged language. Like, you have a right to step into somebody else's culture and then trash that culture and rescue them from their religious culture. Well, I'm against it. I'm sorry. I'm against it. I'm not saying that everybody listening to me has to be against it. But that's where Kish stands. This is Kish's critique, and you are welcome to disagree with me. Leave a comment below the video and tell me that you think I'm up in the night, and it's absolutely crucial to get someone out of the cult. I don't think that cult is a bad word necessarily, and I don't think that the LDS Church is a cult. Okay, so there you have it. I don't. We can argue about it. But I don't think it's a cult. And I don't think it is appropriate in a place where you want to have LDS viewers to ridicule their patriarchal blessings. There you go. That's my critique of John Dehlin. So that's it. I've critiqued John Dehlin's position on this. This doesn't mean that I don't find the show very informative and valuable to me. I don't really care what John Dehlin says about to ridicule patriarchal blessings, and this is partly because his guests had a lot more open-minded and valuable things to say that were interesting, that would make me think and make me ponder. John Dehlin saying, patriarchal blessings are just made up nonsense and nobody should put any value in them. To me, that's a borderline idiotic statement. As much as I love John, that's a borderline idiotic statement. I mean, who is he to say, right? He's giving his opinion. He's entitled to his opinion. But what I'm saying is if you're LDS and you value your patriarchal blessing, you shouldn't care what John has to say about patriarchal blessings. That's about John. That's about where John is today, the day that he said it. Maybe maybe a week from now, he'll regret saying it and saying, well, that was kind of dumb. I shouldn't have done it. But I think it's still important to point out because he is making fun of things that Mormons hold sacred, and it contributes to ridiculing Mormons and Mormonism, which results in real-world harm to faithful Latter-day Saints. Because they show up at a job interview, they get dumb questions, and they're informed by these misunderstandings, this bad information, and really skewed and biased and negative views of their religion. That has a cost. So it's a big problem. I think everybody has a right to speak their mind. I'm not saying John Dehlin doesn't, and I'm not saying that people shouldn't watch his show. I cannot recommend that faithful Latter-day Saints watch Mormon Stories, even though I would love to be able to do so. I think lots of the things that happened, most of what happened on that show, for all the hours that went by, I thought the value in it, there was a great deal of value, but as long as he's going to mock sacred things, I will be unable to recommend that my faithful Latter-day Saint friends watch that show. So there you go, Coffee with Kish. Kish critiques once again. Well, brace ourselves for the comments, if there are any. I'm not saying there necessarily will be, but it is the kind of thing that might provoke disagreement. And that's okay. I think that's part of the conversation. That's a healthy thing, and I embrace that risk that I get from Kish critiquing. Take care. See you next time. Subscribe and like if you value in any way, even as something that makes you angry. And if you like what you see, if you think that it's worthwhile at all, please subscribe and like. See you next time.